Hi, I'm Nick Arnett. I live here in Santa Clara, California, and I'm a CERT instructor for Milpitas and San Jose. For about 15 years, I've been providing and teaching crisis intervention, stress management, peer support, resilience, and related topics for many different public safety and other kinds of organizations, including schools and businesses. I've written a couple of books. Stress Management and Crisis Response is a pocket guide that's used by hundreds of agencies, chaplains, and others to help them remember how to do things like psychological first aid, one of the topics of the training you're about to hear. My newer book is called Resilience During the Pandemic, and I was able to write it quickly because I'm working on a much larger book called Stress into Strength. That'll be coming out from HarperCollins Leadership next year. So enjoy the training and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or you'd like me to put on a training like this for your organization. So the sources for the information I'm giving you today include ICISF. This is the organization that really pioneered the way we do crisis intervention today, starting probably 30, 40 years ago. Of course, a lot of training of California Fire Chaplain Association. Some of this is absolutely based on the CERT disaster psychology curriculum. And then some really good material developed for the Air Force called Master Resilience Training, which is a week-long course, and lots of others. So why teach resilience? So the first part of this is going to be resilience. The second part will be psychological first aid. So why do we teach resilience? First is we know it can be learned, which is a fairly new piece of information. There was, for a long time, the assumption was that you were as resilient as you were born to be, and you couldn't change that. We certainly know it can be learned now, and we know that it works. That when we teach people to be more resilient, it is effective. And I created this slide before the pandemic because I certainly believed before this pandemic hit that we needed it more than ever. And boy, do we really need it more than ever now. So I really want to change the way you think about stress, unless you're a very advanced person in your knowledge of stress. The problem is not stress. The problem is a stuck stress response. There's a reason my upcoming book is called Stress into Strength, because stress absolutely can become strength. So we can change the stuck stress reaction. And that's really what this is going to be mostly about. And I'm going to talk about it in 3 dimensions. You're going to hear this again and again over the next 30, 40 minutes. There's physical, mental, and spiritual stress, strength, and resilience. So we get stressed in those 3 dimensions, and we can build strength and resilience in those 3 dimensions. So the things that stress us are also in those 3 dimensions. So physical stress comes from either these things you see listed happening or the threat of them happening. So of course, right now, the threat of illness or actual illness, injuries, getting too hot, getting too cold, tired, dehydrated, hungry, bankrupt, homeless, unequipped. So things that have to do with the physical world. But there's also social stressors, which can be some of the toughest of all. And being isolated is one of the most difficult social stressors. So one of the things that I'm seeing people recommend and emphasize over and over and over again during the pandemic is that even though we are physically distancing from one another, it is super important not to be socially distanced. But also feeling unappreciated, lonely, criticized, guilty, ashamed, abandoned, those are all social stressors as well. And then I'm using this word spiritual, and I want to be very clear about what I mean by it. What I'm talking about is your sense of purpose, what gives meaning to your life, sort of values that are above and beyond sort of selfish, making money and gaining power and those kinds of things. So the spiritual stressors, and religion can be a source of those, but I'm not necessarily talking about religion. So spiritual stressors include feeling like things are meaningless, feeling aimless, being betrayed by either somebody or something, feeling like things are out of control, feeling helpless, feeling like things are unpredictable. And it's always important to remember that stress can be cumulative. Basically, if you don't activate the recovery reactions, which turn stress into strength, stress will build up, kind of like you got a backpack on that you're putting more and more weight into. Also really important to remember that we only feel stress about things we care about. If you don't care, you're not going to feel stress about it. The really good news is that caring creates resilience. So there was a huge study of about 30,000 US adults done by the University of Wisconsin. And one of the, I'm going to talk a little later about some of the other things they found, but one of the things they found is that people who report real high levels of stress who take care of other people have almost had no health consequences from that stress. And to me, that also explains why things like emotional support peacocks make a certain amount of sense. Not that I want them on an airplane with me when we can fly again, but caring for something or somebody really makes a huge difference in the way we handle stress. So, and even things like the pet rock fad a while back ago, just sort of triggering that caring response from us is very helpful. So the way we react to stress in those three dimensions. So the physical stress reaction is one everybody's heard of, I think. We call it fight or flight. But there's a recovery reaction that is just as natural to us, although we have to work a little harder to make it happen. And that's generally called rest and digest. On the mental side of things, which I'm also calling social, the stress reaction is to defend and distance, sort of either get defensive or get away from whoever's causing you the social stress. The recovery reaction to that is called tend and befriend. So there's the caring for others. And then the spiritual stress reaction is to become more selfish and survivalist. And we've been seeing a lot of that lately. The spiritual recovery reaction is to take a moment, pause, and plan. So I'm going to dive into those three things because the fundamental formula here, this is the 10,000-foot level of this whole thing, is that strength and resilience come from managing intervals of stress and recovery. So it's the right amount of stress, the right amount of recovery at the right intervals. So when you combine physical stress and recovery, you gain strength for doing things. And I think everybody understands this because everybody knows if you go to the weight room and you lift weights, and then you get enough rest and protein and so forth, your muscles grow and become stronger. And there's lots and lots and lots of other physical examples of that I don't have time to include here, but all sorts of things like if you're playing guitar, and you know, if you have the right interval of torturing your fingers by plucking those guitar strings, your fingers become stronger because calluses build up. And there's just, I could give you example after example, but I guess at that, I don't have time. Read the book. I promise not to push the book too hard. So social stress and recovery is where we gain mental and emotional strength for thinking and feeling. And then spiritual stress and recovery, when we combine them, again, it's combining the right amounts with the right intervals. We develop a stronger sense of priorities and purpose, which is also critical to our resilience and our overall strength. So there's a chart, and that just sums it all up. And again, if anybody's joined late, I will be distributing a PDF of these slides afterwards, so you don't need to, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Yeah, the social distance versus physical distancing, I go back and forth on that because when I hear social distancing, the good interpretation of that is to have some distance when you're being social, but people don't hear it right. And so, yeah, I am all for physical distancing, using that term instead. So just like weightlifting, as I alluded to earlier, any kind of stress can hurt you. So even though I don't like the myth of toxic stress, have to acknowledge that stress can hurt you if you lift, like weightlifting, taking on too much stress, lifting too much weight, doing it too often without getting enough breaks from it. You can't just lift. You'll never grow stronger, you'll grow weaker. You got to get the rest and nutrition. If you don't get protein, your muscles will never grow. And if you lift other people's weights for them, you're not helping. Now, they're not going to gain strength because they're not getting the stress they need to trigger that. And you're lifting too much. So you're kind of up there in the, too often, too much area. So we might call that codependency. So big thing about becoming more resilient is we don't have much choice about our stress reactions. Those happen really, really automatically. Those come from a part of our brain that I'll be talking more about that is constantly on alert for anything that might be a threat or an opportunity. and it's just going to trigger whether you want it to or not. Some of our resilience, so that's that's the monkey mind, the stress autopilot that takes over when it detects something that, and it really goes by patterns. There's nothing logical about it. Our recovery reactions, which I'll talk more about, do not happen as automatically. We need to actually be a lot more intentional about activating those recovery reactions. So most of what you find in stress management books, aside from the idea of stress reduction, which I do not like at all, are all about how to trigger your recovery reactions. So building resilience, you kind of have to be an animal trainer, because this part of your brain, the amygdala, if you're a brain physiology person, does not respond to logic very well at all. It is kind of this animal that takes charge when a threat is when it detects a threat, and it does that through patterns. So training your monkey mind really only comes from experiences, experiencing a time of safety, experiencing companionship, knowing you're not alone, and taking control of some of the things you can, trying to get things more predictable, bunch of things we're going to talk about. So the way you activate your recovery reactions are the three things I've already talked about: rest and digest, tend and befriend, pause and plan. So that's sort of another 10,000 foot look at resilience. So we'll take those one at a time. Physical resilience. So that's getting enough of that fight or flight response plus the rest and digest recovery response to get that strength for doing things. So that means rest breaks. When you took your CERT training, I hope your instructors all made it really emphasize the point that when you're in a typical disaster response, unlike this crazy pandemic we have going on, that team leaders need to make sure their teams are taking breaks regularly, rotating people off the most intense parts of that deployment, and just not going 24/7, which is very easy to do when you're in a disaster, because the very definition of a disaster is that the need is greater than the resources to address the need, and your sense of time gets altered. It's I can tell you personally from being in major disasters, it's really easy to forget to take those breaks. Exercise certainly helps a lot. Exercise does activate the fight or flight, but stopping the exercise, your body sort of naturally begins to activate the rest and digest. Getting enough sleep. I'll talk more about this, because as the days go by, it seems more and more psychological, physiological studies come out emphasizing how critically important sleep is to our overall resiliency and strength and so forth. Good nutrition, we'll talk more about that. Connecting with nature. More and more research studies, again, showing that getting out in nature makes a big difference. And then managing your stuff, possessions. We moved at the beginning of March, which was interesting timing. Glad we got it done before things got real crazy. And we've been just getting rid of a lot of stuff. And I've always known that's kind of satisfying to reduce the clutter and get organized, but it certainly helps with resiliency. So I'm not going to go through these next three slides in any detail, but one of the shortcuts to activating really all three of the recovery reactions is through controlled breathing. So belly breathing, 4-7-8 breathing, and then grounding, which is not breathing. So two breathing things and a grounding thing. These are all ways that, especially if you're feeling anxious or you're providing support to someone else who is all wound up and feeling anxious, these are quick ways to help settle down. So I'll let you look at those on the PowerPoint. Oh, and the fourth one, butterfly hug tapping. This is especially good with families and children. And there's ways to do it so that it isn't necessarily obvious to everybody that you're doing it. But no time to go into them in detail. There's a lot more. If you look at controlled breathing on the internet, you'll find all sorts of things. And then there are activities that basically help you get into the present. I mean, those other things do that. And by getting into the present, what I mean is that monkey mind, when we go through, anytime we go through any kind of high stress situation, the monkey mind wants to learn from it. so that if you encounter that kind of thing again in the future, you're better prepared to deal with it. So it'll replay these stressful incidents from your past, especially traumatic ones, where it really got you into that helpless, out of control state, because it wants to learn from it, and that's a good thing. So it's replaying the old incidents and it's rehearsing for the future ones. And I'll talk a little bit more later about that. But these things like progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi, martial arts, they help you get more into the present and get away from that anxiety from the past, worry about the future. And they build up this thing called interoception. I try not to put too many sort of technical words into my presentations, but this is an important one. Interoception is your sense of what your own body is doing. And so many of these things that help us build resilience are all about just noticing what's going on for you. Let's talk about food real fast. Whole grains, processed foods are harder to digest than all the processed foods and so forth. And here's the interesting thing, that's good for you. It's another example of where stress is actually good for you. The harder to digest food has two beneficial effects. One is you get fewer calories from it, and we're all getting too many calories. And there are leftovers essentially to feed your gut fauna, the gut biome, all the bacteria that live in your gut. We don't really know what a healthy gut biome looks like, but we sure know it's critically important, not just for physical health, but mental health as well. I could go on about that, but I won't. So things to avoid. If you just search online for an anti-inflammatory diet, that'll give you all sorts of good suggestions, but carbohydrates are the big bad news. Carbs are just bad for you. And when we're under stress, we tend to crave carbs a lot more because cortisol levels rise, and that makes us crave those carbs. When I don't get a good night's sleep, I can hear the potato chips calling me from the kitchen. Highly processed foods, for the reason I just said above. Trans fats and snacks tend to have a lot of those because it keeps them from spoiling. Fried foods, not so good. Soft drinks, way too much sugar. 25 sugar packets essentially in each one. And things that are labeled low fat and low carb, while that sounds good, they tend to stimulate your appetite and make you overeat. Sleep, I mentioned, is critical, and it's the rapid eye movement, the really deep rapid eye movement sleep that matters the most. So you want to avoid stimulants near bedtime, taking short naps. There seems to be consensus that that's okay. Your room really needs to be dark. If you're working at night and trying to sleep during the day, blackout curtains, super important. Routines help. A cool room is good. Having a regular schedule is super important if you can do that. And then try to use your bedroom as a haven. We don't have a TV in ours. I am actually doing this from my bedroom right now because for the moment my bedroom is my home office, so I'm violating all of my own suggestions here, but hey. And then really important, especially if you've gone through something very high stress or traumatic, not to use substances that are going to interfere with that rapid eye movement sleep. Alcohol is a big one. So we recommend that if you go through something really traumatic, you just steer clear of the alcohol for a few days at least. And then some of the older sleep meds and anti-anxiety medications, those can also interfere with it. So talk to your doctor about that. There's software now that will warm the color of your screen when it gets close to bedtime. That's helpful. But at the same time, there's this state we get into sometimes, which we call tired and wired, where we're really exhausted, but all keyed up. And one of the crazy things is, you ever been driving home at night when you're real tired and you're falling asleep at the wheel practically, but then you get into bed and you're wide awake? So that's tired and wired. It's because your brain no longer has something to focus on. And if you give it something light that is familiar so that it's not going to be real stimulating to you, that it's amazing how well that can help you fall asleep. So for a long time, my go-to program was any rerun of Everybody Loves Raymond, because I've seen them a bunch of times. And, they're funny, but pretty much will put me right to sleep when I'm in that tired and wired state. Another thing which I found actually really works well for me too, instead of putting any pressure on yourself to sleep, Just tell yourself, I'm getting in bed to rest, and rest is good. And then, pay attention to whether your sleep is really restful, and, whether you're getting enough to wake up feeling rested. And if you're getting a lot of sleep and you don't wake up feeling rested, sleep diary and talking to your doctor is probably a good idea. Sleep is critical. So that's the physical stuff. So remember, for mental and emotional resilience, the stress reaction is to defend and distance. The recovery reaction is to tend and befriend. And this, when we combine them the right way, we have strength for thinking and feeling. So I warn you, this will not be as funny, but I love Brene Brown. She just has some great stuff. I'd recommend any book by her. So what she's talking about there is a lot of what goes on with social stress. So it is about risking transparency and vulnerability, but with people who are safe to do that with. And I'll be talking more about, especially in psychological first aid, about what it means to be a safe person, what to look for in other people, about people who are safe people to really get real with. Because this is, the short way of saying choosing social stress is to just get real. Let people see the real you, but no rush. Don't have to be in a big hurry. Get to know people before you open up to them. But it's just like every other part of this. It's about getting out of your comfort zone. When you lift weights, if you don't get out of your comfort zone, you're not going to get any stronger. So this is getting out of your comfort zone, but you don't have to get out very far. So when you do this, don't be surprised by feelings like wanting to defend and explain yourself. That's why I call it defending and distancing, and wanting to go somewhere else. There's the distancing part. And you may feel anger, sadness, guilt, and worst of all, shame. Shame is a giant trap. And that's a lot of why this whole notion of emotional safety is super important. People will sometimes ask, how do I get rid of these bad feelings? And the answer is always the same. There is only one way to get rid of bad feelings, and that's to have them. So that's part of what goes on for us when we're vulnerable in these social situations. So safety means confidentiality, absolutely important. The freedom not to talk. And I'll emphasize this again, when you're doing psychological first aid, you've got to give people permission not to talk. Reflect back to people rather than giving them advice. Some of the people who've been the most valuable in my life are the people who made me more aware of what's going on inside of me. And be kind rather than nice. One of my mentors explains it this way, that when we're nice, it's so that people will like us. When we're kind, we give people gifts they can never repay. And this is not about fixing other people, because basically you can't. It doesn't stop us from trying, especially those of us in public safety, especially when we're the kind of person who volunteers for CERT. We do it to fix problems. But in this domain, we can't fix it. We can't make it better. So to activate social stress recovery, so that was the tend and befriend response that we're triggering. It's all about communicating, cooperating, also competing, with agreed upon rules and that sort of thing, and teamwork. Not taking criticism, which may or not, it may sound to you like criticism, even if it wasn't, but don't take it personally. Just not taking things personally is a gigantically important activator for that social stress recovery. So look for friends who listen without judging or fixing you, those who just accept you really as you are, and be that kind of person for others. Allow people to be heard, seen, accepted exactly as they are. And then avoid isolation. So one of the things that we tell people when we do groups, when we help groups after serious, high stress incidents, is we'll tell them, hey, any thought or feeling that you share that someone else is already also thinking or feeling, even if they didn't say so, you've helped them, because now they know they're not the only ones thinking that or feeling that. And that's really important. That's really helpful. So the idea is that you want to encourage people's natural healing processes. Most people get through stress and trauma really, really well. The worst thing we can do is interfere with that. The best thing we can do is encourage it. So it's all about helping people care for themselves, those around them. So Janet Childs is on the call with us. Janet is the director of our Bay Area Critical Incident Stress Management team. And this is something I absolutely learned from her. You are each other's best support. The people you go through high stress with are the best supporters of all. And if there's any, one of the, I sort of hate to say good things about the pandemic is that it's affecting everyone. There is nobody who doesn't at some level understand what everybody else is going through. And that makes us stronger. And fundamentally, you can't give away what you haven't got. So social connections, when I talk about social support, that's pretty broad. That can be friends, family, mentors, coaches, teams, just all the people in your lives, and our furry and perhaps even our feathered friends. So the top two scenes are from, I think, the North Bay fires, where I was with CAL FIRE's Employee Support Services and had the privilege of bringing in a lot of dog teams and driving around Sonoma County with dog handlers and their crisis response dogs, which was great. Excuse me, we have a horse. That's not our horse in the lower left corner, but horses are incredibly sensitive to where we are emotionally. I'm just amazed by the things I read and learn about how effective horses are at helping that activate those stress recovery responses. And then the parrot in the lower right is ours. And again, caring creates resilience. So by caring for her, I know we create some resilience. She's like a 4-year-old who never grows up, though, so it's a challenge. And I just came across this today and had to share it. If we're Facebook friends, you may have seen it, or it's on the Stress into Strength Facebook page. But after listening to Linda, his human, for 12 days while in quarantine, as she complained for hours on end, Sparky realized he was not cut out to be an emotional support dog. I had to send that to all my friends who are with Hope Animal Assisted Crisis Response. Is just this fabulous organization that I've worked with. So social support doesn't mean fixing the problem or the person. I'm going to urge you to watch this on your own. So go to YouTube and look up It's Not About the Nail if you haven't seen it. And it is linked, or I'll make sure it's linked in the PDF. But I don't think we have time to actually watch it right now. So spiritual resilience. So here's the third dimension. And remember, that was the stress response is to become more selfish or survivalist. And the recovery response is to pause and plan. And that helps give us strength for priorities and purpose. So the goals here are really to learn, adopt, live out a set of values, know your purpose, why you do what you do. And it also helps to really have a sense of wonder and awe. So I'm kind of lumping a bunch of contemplative practices under this heading. Anything that, remember, as I talked about yoga and some of those other things, those have a lot of the same effects here, getting you into the present, out of that anxiety from the past, out of the worry about the future. We lose our perspective when we're highly stressed. We lose our normal sense of time. Things either speed up or slow down. We lose our perspective because we get tunnel vision and can't see the big picture. So the monkey mind gets back into the present and settles down when we do some of these contemplative things, and gets it out of that replaying and rehearsing that I talked about. Types of contemplative practices: meditation, prayer, mindfulness, just unplugging in general, retreating, journaling. Really, any of these things that pause and plan. Again, considering your priorities. Look at your checkbook. Look at your calendar. Those tend to reveal what our priorities really are versus what we think maybe they should be. And then rocket fuel for all of this is gratitude and generosity. They build optimism, they build positive thinking, and they get your brain out of what psychologists call the default mode, which tends to be pretty negative. So gratitude challenge for 30 days, doesn't have to be in a row. Just write down 3 things you're grateful for, 3 things you're looking forward to, and these could be little or big things. So Native Americans, Cherokee, have a fable that I just love called The Tale of Two Wolves. And it's about a grandfather talking to his grandson. The grandfather says, all of us have 2 wolves inside of us. One is angry and jealous and fighting and just a pain in the butt to be around. The other one is kind and loving and generous and supportive and so forth. And they're always fighting with each other. So the grandson looks to the grandfather and says, well, which one wins the fight? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. And that is just a great way to think about all of this. And the biggest mistake we make is that we think if we just get away from the source of stress, we're going to get into recovery, and that doesn't happen. So there's Homer, and he is trying to starve the bad wolf by sitting in the magic sofa that turns blood into lead, watching the TV. But just getting away doesn't necessarily reduce the stress at all. And there's a neurophysiological basis for all this. So I promise not to get too much into this level of detail, but if you ever took human biology and that sort of thing, you know that we have a sympathetic nervous system. That's that fight or flight response, along with the other stress responses: defender, distance, selfish, and survivalist. And even though the Cherokees called that the bad wolf is our ally when we need to either deal with a threat or even rise to an opportunity. Because opportunities, it isn't just threats that make our hearts pound. I mean, falling in love makes your heart pound. That's the same stress response, but it's, we'd call it good stress. And then the good wolf is the parasympathetic nervous system. That's the other half of your autonomic nervous system, and that's rest and digest, tend and befriend, and so forth. Let me see what's going on here in the chat. Oh, well, sorry you have to leave early. We will be doing the class again. So one other thing about this is don't confuse the journey of gaining resilience with its rewards. When you become more resilient, I call all these things resilience routines, these things I'm talking about that build, that activate the recovery. You will end up with more motivation, more self-discipline, but those are the results. They're not how you get there. How you get there is this way. You start small and you start over. Give yourself unlimited permission to fail and begin again. Whether this is getting into an exercise routine or eating better or, getting better sleep, whatever it is, start small, start over, unlimited permission to fail. And turn the shoulds into positive things. So big one right now is, I should not touch my face. So instead of that, make it the positive one. By not touching my face, I'm reducing the chance of infection. I should stay home, or even, I have to stay home. Think of it, just switch up your thinking a little. Think about how it accomplishes something positive. Staying home keeps our family healthy. And instead of thinking about time management, think about energy management. Where do you want to invest your energy? So remember that one. Start small, start over. And here's another one that I've heard, I'm sure, 1,000 times, and I'm not kidding, at least 1,000 times from my mentor, Janet. Be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with yourself. That's what giving yourself unlimited permission to fail means. Go as easy on yourself as you would to your friend. So the old paradigm for stress management and so forth was that we'd manage our time. Now we talk about managing energy. We used to think stress is a bad thing and must be avoided. That's like avoiding the weight room. You will not grow stronger by avoiding the weight room or any of the rest of this kind of stress. So it's more seeking the right kind of stress, the right amount, the right timing. And we used to, Silicon Valley certainly has a culture that downtime is wasted time. No, it's productive because it's when those recovery responses activate. And instead of treating your life like a marathon, treat it like a series of sprints. So high stress, high recovery, high stress, high recovery. Self-discipline is not the starting point. It's more about building those routines by starting small and starting over. And rather than deciding where to invest your time, decide where to invest your energy. So that is the resilience part of it. We're going to jump into PFA, psychological first aid. I think I'm going to save, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. I'm watching it, but I think I'm just going to sort of keep going here. So this idea of psychological first aid has been around for decades. And one of the confusing things about it is there's been at least 50 different protocols that have been invented for it over those decades. But over the last, 7 or 10 years or so, we've really been zeroing in on research informed. This is real. All of this stuff is super tough to research. You can't traumatize a group and have a control group that's not traumatized to compare the results. So hard to study, hard to research, but we do have some pretty good research informed protocols that we're confident work pretty well. And so we're using it more and more as part of critical incident stress management. When we deal with individuals, we're using psychological first aid, one of several protocols. We do use other techniques with teams, and you heard about some of those in your CERT training. But the goals are to restore people's sense of safety, help them get from out of control to in control, assist them with current needs, get them out of isolation and into community, and then figure out as we assess and pay attention to what else they might need, offer them additional support or refer them. And so that could be to their own social support network, encouraging them to hook in with the support that's out there for them, getting to professional support when needed, and if it's bad enough, calling 911, which I will talk about. So the essential components are help stabilize people, reduce that stress response. So once again, it's about activating these recovery reactions that are natural reactions, and just your presence activates that tend and befriend response in you and them. Remember, caring creates resilience. So if you're in a disaster, whether it's this weird ongoing big one we're in right now, or hurricane, tornado, flood, earthquake, whatever, again, just your presence makes a big difference. So you want to gather information, sort of assess what their needs are, set some priorities, give them practical assistance as you're able to, help them connect to other support. And then there are handouts that you'll see. By the way, at the end of this, I'm going to strongly encourage you, if you want to do psychological first aid, to take one or even both of the free online training courses that are available. So I'll have links to those, because all I can do in this short time is just kind of introduce you to the ideas. And those come with handouts. Our Bay Area CISM team has handouts that we share quite freely. And then support people will refer them to a higher level of care as needed. And as always, your number one job in CERT is your own safety and taking care of yourself, which is why this whole thing started with resilience, because resilience really is about self-care. It's just that word sometimes backfires. So the typical phases of a disaster are that first there's sort of pre-disaster. That's like there's a tornado warning or something and people are afraid, uncertain, shock, disbelief. Then there's the impact phase. It actually happens. Now we're worried for ourselves and our loved ones. And then there's the heroic phase, where our first responders are, in the pandemic right now, public safety and healthcare, they're all heroes, and just getting a lot of love. And that's very typical for a while. And there's a honeymoon phase, and we're sort of in and out of that, where we sort of feel like, we're bonding together, we're going to overcome this. I think there's a whole lot of this at the local level. Nationally, it's a little more complicated. Not going to go too far into that at all. But sort of that, really very typical to have that positive feeling that, we're coming together, we're going to overcome. And then people start realizing the limits of recovery. And I think we're going to be in and out of that a lot for the next few months or even years, as the reality of trying to recover from disaster sinks in. And then finally get to a point where, we keep talking about what's the new normal going to be, and one day we'll wake up and the new normal is just normal. And heaven knows when that's going to come for the pandemic, but we will get there. One of the things that really struck me was somebody who pointed out that it is absolutely normal for the world to have a pandemic every 100 years or so. So even though this feels very abnormal for us, because it's never happened to us before, it is, and I find this oddly reassuring, that to just realize that it is normal for the world to go through this kind of thing. It's not easy, and it's got awful consequences, but it is normal in that way. We just forgot it was normal, I guess. So these phases were really described for communities, and communities do tend to go through them more or less in order on average. But individually, we could be all over the place, much like the stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with. Janet actually worked with Elizabeth and has told us that one of the things that bothered her about the way it was being interpreted was that people thought you'd go through the stages sequentially, and it's not a straight line. It's more like spaghetti. And these phases that are really observations of communities, we also tend to, we go through those somewhat individually as well. So I mentioned this before, but it's really worth mentioning again as we jump into psychological first aid. One of the first things I usually tell people is I'm not here to fix this or make it better. And that really helps people relax, because I guess it tells them you understand that you can't, and you're not going to should on them. You're not going to tell them what to do. You're not going to try and take control from them. You're going to give them control. So more than anything else, you want to be this comforting and calming presence. You want to adapt that to their culture, their age, their background, and so forth. There's a lot to know about cultures and ages and backgrounds. None of us know it all. And listen. A whole lot of it's listening. And as you're listening, assessing needs and concerns of the people you're listening to. And there's this thing called reflective listening, where you're really listening for the emotions behind the words and acknowledging those. So acknowledging the positives, acknowledging the negatives, and I'll go a little bit more into this. And always keep it very, very simple, and use clarifying statements and so forth as needed. Don't go off into jargon, and try not to get too intellectual, because what we're dealing with here is much more about emotions and reactions than thoughts. So one of the best things you can bring to when you're responding to do psychological first aid is your curiosity. Not your curiosity about what happened to them or details of their experience and so forth, but really much more about their reaction. How is it for you to be going through this? So psychological first aid is part of a much bigger picture. So this is really a description of the big picture of what we call critical incident stress management. And it starts with things we do before things happen. It includes individual support, team and group support, referrals. We do these team interventions called defusing and debriefings. Those are for people who were a team before the incident and are going to continue to be a team afterwards. There's spiritual support, family support, and then the professional stuff, therapy and inpatient on-site care. Psychological first aid is that part there, giving individual support. It can be used for groups, and being able to do referrals to a higher level of care is critical at all phases of this. So the big stressors for the pandemic are just our loss of control. The monkey mind does not like to feel out of control. So we've lost our freedom to move about. We've had shortages of things. There's a lot of out of control right there. And then there is the isolation, the loss of the social support, all those different things, and the loss of rituals like sharing meals, going out to clubs, worshiping together, being able to have a funeral, even sports. Sports is a ritual, whether you're participating in it or observing it. We're missing those rituals, going to the movies and so forth. Just a whole bunch of comforting social rituals are gone. And then, of course, there is the health threat itself to us and those we care about. And there's the indirect health. So my brother and sister both have cancer. My brother needed to have a procedure done. Really didn't want to set foot in a hospital, especially an emergency room. Really didn't want to get admitted to a hospital. Unfortunately, ended up admitted for the procedure. He's back home now. But I'm sure there's lots of people who are worrying about their health because they're unwilling to go near a hospital. Normal health services are just not available. And then, we're having an epidemic of domestic violence, and that's affecting adults and children. And so a lot's trying to be done to address that and to make sure that there are, here in Santa Clara County, at least, there are hotels, motels that have been set up as places that victims of domestic violence can be sheltered in if they need to be. And then, of course, there's the stress of the economic threat. People have lost their jobs. People wonder if they're going to have jobs. And then we're looking at recession, depression, and we just have no idea what the coming months and years are going to look like. And just all this unpredictability and uncertainty. Like I said, the monkey mind does not like out of control. It doesn't like uncertainty. It hates unpredictability. Our monkey mind hates unpredictability so much that we very often would prefer to have something negative that's predictable than something positive. And I'm not going to go into examples of that, but all these questions about the pandemic, we don't know when it's going to end. We don't know how bad it'll become. We're getting conflicting messages from institutions that are supposed to be our source of knowledge. And we have really very little idea of what the world's going to look like after this pandemic is over. And there's some sneaky stressors to always be aware of when you're helping people with psychological first aid. One is affiliation. When you have a connection to somebody, or you're dealing with others, and they're connected to the victim of a bad thing that's happened, certainly, obviously part of the same family, but part of the same community, the more connections you have, the more you're likely to feel the stress that they went through. And then there's secondary vicarious stress, which is the stress you will pick up from doing psychological first aid with people who are in a lot of stress. You're going to feel their stress, because you're only going to do this, and you probably volunteered for CERT because you have some degree of empathy. You want to help. That empathy is why you're good at it, but it also means you're going to take on some of it. So that's why the self-care is so incredibly important. And then there are trigger patterns. So the monkey mind is always looking for familiar patterns that remind it of a time that either your life was or wellness was threatened, or the wellness of somebody you care about was threatened. And so that could be sights, smells, sounds, calendar dates. And then one of the sneakiest ones of all is identification. The more the victim of a bad thing resembles you, the more you may feel, you or someone you care about, the more you may feel their stress. So as an example, if firefighters respond to, let's say it's a cardiac arrest of a 10-year-old boy. Well, if one of those firefighters has a 10-year-old boy at home, that firefighter is probably going to feel a much stronger reaction to that. If that child is wearing the same kind of clothes as their child wears, much stronger reaction. If that child goes to the same school, much stronger. So identification is a sneaky one. And then that whole thing about unpredictability and lack of control can really sneak up on people too, because we don't always expect that. Really, really, really important thing to remember. So psychological first aid is very much helping people with traumatic situations. This is where, the stress is exceeding people's ability to cope. It's like lifting too much weight. There's an injury there. But always, always, always remember, there is no such thing as a traumatic incident. Nothing, no matter how bad it is automatically traumatic for everybody who deals with it. So there are only potentially traumatic incidents. There's an EMT who works for our 911 ambulance service here in Santa Clara County who has looked me in the eye more than once and said she does not have a hard time dealing with doing CPR on babies. She's a rare, rare person. Most people are traumatized by having to do CPR on a baby. But I take her at her word. It's just, you don't know what people are able to deal with. And you may suspect that somebody is in denial when they say that they're not having a strong reaction, but you have to respect that. Because if you teach somebody that something is traumatic, you can make it traumatic for them. You can activate their monkey mind. So that's why it is just super, super important. Actually, I think I wanted the next slide. Yes. Super, super important. My slides are in the right order. Not to focus on what happened, but to pay attention to how people are reacting to it. If they're not having strong reactions, you don't need to take a lot of action. And that includes your own reactions, right? So always remember, no such thing as a traumatic incident. It's how people are reacting that counts. So we want to restore physical safety. So with the pandemic, we can't really remove people from the incident, but if it's a fire, flood, earthquake, hurricane, whatever, if you can get people away from the unsafe area in particular, where they don't have to see it, they know that they are safe, that makes a huge difference. That's really the first thing we want to do. And then you can't really do anything for people psychologically, emotionally, if they're not feeling physically taken care of. So if they need shelter, if they need food, if they need health care, those things come first. And then, getting enough rest and sleep, of course, those are recovery activators as well. So emotional safety, I've already talked a lot about this, but again, you got to keep everything confidential. Make sure that anything you tell people, you're absolutely certain is true. I made the mistake once doing crisis intervention of repeating something a police officer told me because I thought it was true, found out it wasn't. and just it broke trust with the people I was working with. He said it kind of a little white lie to make people feel good. Well, don't do that ever. You break trust, and now you really can't help people at all. Our monkey mind is naturally suspicious, naturally distrustful. And so if you give people a reason not to trust you, the monkey mind is going to grab it. So only share information you're absolutely certain is accurate. Never, ever, ever push, prod, pressure. You're not a surgeon. You're not an emotional surgeon. That's what psychiatrists and some therapists do. If you open somebody up by pushing and prodding, you don't have the skills to sew them back up and stop the bleeding. So invite, don't push or prod. So, and this goes back to giving people permission not to talk. That's one of the very first things I do, if I'm with a group especially. I'll say it's perfectly okay for you to sit here and say nothing. The amazing thing is that often convinces people to talk, but give people permission not to talk. And then spiritual safety. You got to respect other people's priorities. No judgment. Again, no shoulds for all the reason I talked about. Really have to accept their beliefs and bring compassion more than anything else. And remember to have compassion for yourself as well. So normal physical stress reactions. This is the fight or flight stuff. We've talked about some of it. I mentioned it's very typical to crave carbohydrates, sugar, potato chips, that sort of stuff. It's very common to have GI and digestion issues, feel anxious, headaches, fatigue. There's this thing called allostatic overload where when the monkey mind stays activated for a long time, we just feel like our blood has turned into lead. It is normal to want to see people do more use of drugs and alcohol, or become more hyperactive and adrenaline-seeking behaviors. I don't know what it's like on the freeways where you are, but here in California, people are driving way too fast. And I think that's partly they're distracted and partly, it's a bit of a stress response. And then sleep disturbances, that tired and wired feeling is a very common one as well. So on the social sort of mental emotional side, that's the defend and distance reaction. It's, I'm still kind of having, can this really be happening? Can this really be going on for months? It seems like a movie, doesn't seem quite real. And that's very normal, especially at first. Or just being in denial, I'm fine. Later on, I'm going to say that, one of the things we don't want to do is go up to people and say, how you doing? Because the usual answer is fine. And in our world of crisis intervention, FINE is an acronym for clean version, fouled up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional, or excitable if you prefer. It is normal to be moody, irritable, angry, frustrated, withdrawn. Distrust and suspicion, like I said, the monkey mind is distrustful and suspicion. And we really get into very black and white, us or them, kind of even tribal thinking. Everything's either right or wrong. And there's a lot of us or them. And that's surfacing as racial stereotyping and prejudice, and of course we've already had a huge us versus them political divide in this country. That's likely to just get accelerated even more because that's the way our monkey minds think. We become suspicious of the outsider the more stressed we are. And memory and concentration difficulties are pretty standard too. And we get hungry for information. And so that's part of the reason, and especially information that gives us a sense of control. So the reason we get a lot of rumors and conspiracy theories is that those create kind of an illusion of control. So best example of this in the pandemic is all the conspiracy theories that say that this was somehow intentional, right? Well, if it was intentional, what that tells our monkey mind is that we can prevent it from happening in the future because it's not just a random event. Remember, the monkey mind loves predictability. It doesn't like random at all. That's out of control. So if you look at the rumors and conspiracies through this lens of control, they'll make a lot more sense. And there's also some of the tribal us versus them stuff going on with that too. And then normal spiritual stress reactions, that's the selfish and survivalist stuff. That's that loss of perspective. So hoarding. It's hard to say what's hoarding and what's good preparedness, especially given what we've been through. But sort of the extreme hoarding is just, that's a loss of perspective of priorities and values. And you get kind of the altered sense of time, the tunnel vision where you forget you actually forget some of your ethics and morals, and struggle with new priorities and really what what is the most important thing to be doing? Why do I do what I do? Finding meaning, finding purpose. So this is a handout that Janet created for our Bay Area Critical Incident Stress Management team. Certainly you're going to be free to reuse this as you like. It just describes a whole bunch of these physical, social, and spiritual reactions that people have in the aftermath of the really high stress incidents. And remember, it's never a straight line, it's spaghetti. I always urge people not to study these too much, because if we educate people too much about the reactions, they tend to have them more. So the purpose of this is more to reassure people that they're having normal reactions. It's just one of the most important things to do. So to do psychological first aid, you want to invite a person. Remember, bring your curiosity about how it is for them. So just, how are you doing? Ask these open-ended questions. Don't ask yes or no questions like, are you okay? So how are you doing? Is it okay if we talk for a few minutes? Make sure you get their name and try to use their name. Especially under stress, you put me with a group of, 5 people, and I might remember 1 or 2 persons' names, but I do my best. Talking one-on-one, hopefully we all remember the name of the person we're talking to, but your brain is stressed too, and those things can be hard. Give them absolute assurance of confidentiality. The only exceptions to that would be if, they're going to hurt themselves or somebody else. Keep everything as simple as possible. Avoid using jargon and avoid using cliches. Cliches just are very isolating. They don't do much good. So some of the kinds of things you can ask are, what's most important to you right now? And that's where you may discover that it's something about their physical safety, their physical health that is more important than anything emotional. And the words, "Can you tell me more about that?" or something similar are very powerful. And just inviting them to talk. But remember, invite, don't pressure. And then again, these are from Janet, these 2 questions. What's hardest for you right now? That's getting them into the present. That's letting them take what is probably a very complicated situation that's impacting every part of their lives, and helping them to narrow it down to just what's the hardest thing right now. And when people can answer that question, they very often then are able to answer that second question, what do you need the most right now? If you start with the what do you need the most, very often people don't know. But if they can pick that hardest thing at the moment, they often can. And then just, an awful lot of psychological first aid is just acknowledging and normalizing what you're hearing, not so much the words as the emotions underneath. So if they sound angry, if they sound scared, whatever, you could literally say, you sound angry. It makes sense that you'd be angry, things like that. One thing you don't want to say is, I understand, because you probably don't. We all kind of understand the pandemic, but even then, we don't really know how it is for each other. So it's not about understanding, but you don't have to understand to have empathy, right? Empathy does not require understanding. But we want to reassure people, hey, you're having a natural reaction to a world that has become very abnormal, or to a very abnormal incident, if it's a single incident. And you can reassure them, a lot of people are feeling that way, or a lot of people would feel the same way in this situation. Normalize. And then here's the acknowledgement. You sound very frustrated, angry, sad. And you can even say things like, that makes sense to me. And if you're feeling a little bit of that, it's okay. If it's genuine, it's okay to say that too. And just sentences like, that's got to be really difficult. That's got to be really hard. So doing this on the phone, challenging for sure. So one thing is, don't multitask. I get real tempted, especially if I'm not on video, to be doing, something else as I'm listening to somebody, but don't do it, because the other person's going to figure it out. They're going to know if you're not there. Stay present. Make sure that the area you're doing it from is quiet, and that's really more than anything else about confidentiality. If you're talking to somebody and they think maybe they're on speakerphone, or you're doing it with Zoom or video, if they can hear other people in the background, they're going to be wondering if those other people can hear what they are saying. So reassure them of that confidentiality. And so the having video is probably best when you can't do it in person, because you're picking up some clues. At least when they're sitting silently, it's a lot easier to let that silence happen, and silence is a powerful tool. If you're doing video, try to have a calming background. This Zoom virtual background is kind of cool if you can make it work. Like I said, the silence is easier when you can see each other, but do allow that silence even if it's just a phone call. If it goes on for a really long time, you can just kind of check in with them. How you doing? Eye contact, even with video, is pretty difficult. And then I have done crisis intervention by text, but holy cow, that's just not easy at all. Especially if you've got somebody who's really in trouble and you're concerned they might be suicidal or something, and they just disappear. That's high stress for you because that's kind of out of control. So texting is kind of a last resort. And then phone would be next, and video best of all when we can't do it in person. So if you call somebody up and you have to leave a message, you want to keep the reason you're calling confidential. So introduce yourself, say who referred you, not why they referred you. So I make these calls all the time, and it's Janet who's usually referred me, and I'll say, hey, Janet Childs asked me to give you a call. Here's my number. You can call me back. And that's it. I don't say anything about why I'm calling, because you don't know who might hear that message. And then when you actually do connect with somebody, if you're going to be getting back to them, you want to ask them what's okay to say if you leave a message in the future. Again, confidentiality. And then, actually doing this stuff over the phone, that's a little redundant, can be difficult because you're not getting those visual cues. So introduce yourself, keep it all pretty casual. And if this is your first contact with somebody, it's sort of the same as leaving a message. Hi, this is Nick Arnett, Janet Childs of the Center for Living with Dying, Bay Area Critical Incident Stress Management Team. Asked me to give you a call and see how you're doing. And expect to have to repeat yourself, repeat your name. Remember, stress screws with people's memories, especially short-term memory. So be ready to gently repeat things. And also definitely ask them, is this a good time to talk? Sometimes people will start just pouring out emotions, and then they suddenly realize that it's not a good time to talk. And now they're kind of going to be left hanging. So before diving in, find out if it's a good time to talk. Ask them how much time they have too. So during the call, do allow silence. As they're talking, saying things like, mm-hmm, okay, and yep, just little sounds like that can let them know you're there, and that's helpful. And then there's the challenge of ending the call. Sometimes it's easy, but sometimes people just want to talk and talk and talk. You're going to have a time limit at some point. So be ready, set yourself a little reminder so that you can say, hey, I'm going to need to go in about 5 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we finish? And if you want to offer a follow-up, do that. And then children, I do have a whole section in the little red book on children, but so I'm just going to do super high level here. It's the same basic skills, but with preschoolers, you really want to coach the parents more than anything else. And you want to deal much more with the parents than the child. When they're kind of in that under 10-year-old area, they don't, we do want to protect them. They're not in a place to handle a lot of the information. And boy, keep the TV news turned off if you've got little ones. I haven't watched TV news since spring of 2004, and I don't miss it at all. So I'm in favor of just getting rid of TV news altogether. But if you have kids, especially kids under 10, make sure they're not getting exposed to the television news or other details that might be scary. But when they get to be adolescents, and there's a gray area there, but when they get to be adolescents, we really treat them as adults, and we give them information, and we realize they're not going to behave like adults, but we treat them like adults. So very important is knowing when to refer to a higher level of care. So if people are not doing well and they're rapidly getting worse, you want to refer them. If there is domestic, child, or elder abuse, absolutely want to refer them. If they need medication, you want to help make that happen. That's going to become your number one priority. So I through Medical Reserve Corps, I sometimes have volunteered in Red Cross shelters, and that's the first thing we're doing with a lot of people is just coordinating with their pharmacist and their doctor and so forth to get them the medications they need. Long-term coping difficulties, if a month is going by and people are still really struggling, that makes sense for referral. And when I'm talking about referrals here, it could be different things, but therapist, psychiatrist, their primary care doctor who can further refer. Just use your head about that. And then with children, it is normal for children to regress developmentally when these bad things happen. Get more clingy, want to sleep in bed with mom and dad, start wetting the bed again, things like that. That's not significant developmental stuff, but when it starts becoming more severe, that's a referral as well. And anyone who requests it, absolutely you want to refer. And then there are these sort of high risk situations. So this is the person who's usually it's suicidal. Sometimes might be homicidal. I don't run into that too often, thank goodness. But there's 3 levels of this. So the first is they're expressing an intention. I am thinking of killing myself, and if you suspect that at all, partly for your own monkey mind, you need to ask them very directly: are you thinking of killing yourself? Just that directly. Don't paraphrase. Don't beat around the bush. If they have that intention, but they only have the intention, you want to help them make an appointment with a therapist or somebody who can give them a higher level of care. But the next question is, do you have a plan? How would you do it? And if they do have that plan, then you need to sort of get an appointment for them right away. So it's not super urgent, but it's very urgent. But if they have the resources to carry out that plan, right? So I'm going to shoot myself. I want to kill myself. I'm going to shoot myself. I have a gun. Okay, now it's time to try to persuade them to do it themselves. Because remember, you want to allow people control whenever you can. Are you willing to call your doctor? And you really want to make sure that's happening. Conference call, whatever, or the police, because the police, are equipped to handle this. Although, of course, some people are not going to want to deal with the police at all. And you respect that as much as you can, but if you just cannot get this to happen and they have the intention, the plan, and the resources to carry it out, at some point you've got to decide that you're just going to call 911 and get them, take care of them. You don't want to live with a decision to not do something because it might make them angry or whatever. Just set all that aside and save a life, because at that point they've put their life in your hands, whether they're saying that or not. So, as I mentioned, I really want to strongly encourage you that if you're interested in doing psychological first aid, this was a high-level overview. National Center for, it's National Child Trauma, something or other learning center. They, along with the Veterans Administration, developed a psychological first aid training that's available online. And I'll show you in a moment. There's a field manual as well that goes with that. And then George Everly, who is one of the founders of modern crisis intervention, has been one of my instructors, put together a course with some other folks at Johns Hopkins, and that's available again for free on Coursera. That goes into more depth, and George Everly is just a treasure. He is a wonderful, wonderful instructor. So again, and those links will be active in the PDF. I believe they'll be active in the PDF I send out, but I'll make sure I have all the links in the email that I attach it to. So there's the field operations guide that's downloadable from the VA or the Child Trauma Center. And don't forget to feed your good wolf. I love that story. And there are the books again. I have to close it out with a little promotion. If buying, especially the book on the left there, is going to help me do more of this free training, which I will be doing. Feel free to share my information with your CERT teams and leaders and so forth.